Good evening. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Well, let me just say, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. It's always great to take this show on the road, so to speak. A little bit more about me. I'm born and raised in Washington, D.C., so it's about, I'm from the place that this was all about protecting, I guess you could say. And another thing I also do, I have another Facebook page. It's actually a personal one that I started on my own, the Civil War Era Historians page. So you can look that up if you want on Facebook. And yes, it is the National Park Service's page, not mine, which is the Civil War Defenses of Washington. I wanted to say this before I started. Well, for one thing, I never really come over to Virginia for anything. I live in Maryland now, up in Howard County, up south of Baltimore, but I never come to Virginia for anything, except for stuff like this. And it just really amazes me when I took this job with the Civil War Defenses of Washington, which is something I really wanted. When you think of like a historic site, you often think of that site being there, you know, there's like a historic building preserved or something, or is this space or whatever. So much of what the CWDW, as we call it, is gone. There's nothing left. In some cases, there's not even really signs saying there was a fort here, or there was a battery here, or rifle pits, or what have you. So it's kind of really, how do you interpret this history when you don't have anything to interpret? But one of the things that still exists, and that's right here, and really most of the forts that I'm going to talk about tonight in Arlington, which I really believe this place was the heart of the CWDW. The one thing that still exists, which I'm always kind of blown away with, is the terrain, is the, whatever you call it, topography or whatever it is, where you can go into Arlington and you all, I guess, live here and everything, and you see all the hills. All that is what was the Civil War Defenses of Washington. I went to one site, Fort Lyon, which is, there's nothing left except a sign, which is where the Huntington Metro Station is. And I can look downhill. And that really, just really always amazes me, just to see that. So when I'm coming in Arlington tonight and seeing all that, I think that that's really cool. So on that note, let's go ahead and start. So starting off with this quote, "Civil war is now imminent. The loss of Fort Sumter is not of itself of much importance." And I've highlighted parts here, so I might even just read just that part. But in this case, I'll just read this. Not of much importance in the military point of view to this government. The immediate apprehensions of the government are for this city, Washington, D.C. The chiefs of the Southern Confederacy loudly declare their intention for attacking it immediately if the border states, Maryland and Virginia, joined them. Virginia is not thought of as a border state, but actually that term border state, if you're familiar with the Civil War, actually even predates the Civil War, believe it or not. It's really just kind of a synonym for the Upper South. The DC government, previously to the issue of the proclamation this morning, was already making arrangements with the governors of the northern states to obtain volunteers and militia to defend it. So that's a British diplomat, that's ambassador to the United States in the opening days of the war. So this will kind of set the tone for what I'm going to talk about tonight with this Civil War Defenses of Washington, 1861. So these are a couple of slides here of something that I often see. People who have interest in the Civil War, they're enthused about it, ask this question in one form or another. Was there ever an official reason as to why the Confederate Army chose not to invade Washington, D.C. in the beginning of days of the Civil War when the city was completely unprotected? This person believes, and I just got this offline somewhere, but this person believes that the city was completely undefended. Okay, and here's another one. After Bull Run, first Bull Run in July 1861, why didn't the Confederates chase the fleeing Union troops to Washington, D.C.? That battle was a major rout for the Yankees, for the Union. Capture the city, arrest the senior federal leadership, and thereby end the war. This guy's really out for blood. So, but that's a good question. Okay, so why didn't that happen? This Union Army kind of fell apart on the field. They all ran back to DC. Why didn't the Confederates just keep the juggernaut up and go after them? So we'll look at why that didn't happen, or could it have happened, or anything like that. So for this, I'm just going to show, and this is really brief, it's like 3 minutes or whatever it is. If you've seen the movie Gettysburg before, okay, I've seen it enough times I can quote some lines, but if you've ever seen it, this is a scene, brief scene from that movie. I think we don't have to turn the lights down or anything, but it is where two Confederate generals, General Lewis Armistead and this man on the horse, General Richard Garnett, are talking just before Pickett's charge, the final moment of the Battle of Gettysburg, or at least the final moment as presented in this film. And they're talking about just anticipation for this charge and what's going to happen afterwards, after they, of course, they're successful, which this man, Richard Garnett, believes. He's a Confederate general. And here's what he has to say. And by the way, this video is from YouTube. It does have Spanish subtitles, so everybody is aware of that. No problem with that, but just so there's no surprises. So let me just play this real quick. That's right. You can't do that. He's a perfect target. We're going to break that line. When the Yankees run away, there's going to be an open road all the way to Washington. Maybe we'll win. It'll be the last day. Maybe today. I got it. I'll see you. Okay, so we're able to get out of that. Okay, all right, and let's see. Okay, there we go. So get back to slideshow here. Hang on, bear with me. Okay, so so that was the scene from the movie Gettysburg, just July 1863, and it's at least suggesting that DC is something of an undefended place. If they don't mention anything about the Civil War defenses of Washington, so you'd almost get the impression that there was no CWDW, there were no protective forts. The question I would ask is, well, if there were no protective forts, what are you doing in Gettysburg? But okay. The outline of my program tonight is just going over these things. First of all, was DC in danger of attack, invasion, or even secession? Ever consider that? DC, when the war begins, if a border state is a place that remains loyal to the Union, but has slavery, DC was certainly that place. DC is a place where people live, just like then, just like now. Was DC a border city? Okay. And also in terms of building the Civil War defenses. So where were the first forts built? We'll talk about that. When were they built? Which was the first fort? What was the Arlington line? Talk some about that too. And what were the defenses by First Bull Run? And then the last thing, could the Confederate Army have made a serious attack on DC after First Bull Run? This goes back to what you saw in the video there. Okay, so the first part of threats to Washington City, DC, and sometimes I refer to it that way if you notice Washington City, DC, and not just Washington, DC, because that's often the way it was written about during the time. Sometimes Washington, DC, sometimes Washington City. It's all the same place, but that's sometimes how it's historically written. So this is a map when the war starts, just some key dates there. And I've color coded that towards like Confederate victories, if you will, in gray, and then Union victories, Union concerns in blue. So the bombardment of Fort Sumter happens over those couple of days. Fort Sumter surrenders. And then on the 15th, President Lincoln calls for 75,000 90-day volunteers. This is the most he could do. He can't declare war or anything like that. And it's important, I think, to remember that the Civil War was neither a declared nor undeclared war. It's not like Pearl Harbor, where the next day the president stands before Congress. Yesterday, April 12th, 1861, a date which will live in infamy. That doesn't happen. And it also doesn't really have, at the end of the war, on the deck of a big battleship, accepting the Confederate surrender and things like that. So it doesn't really have, I think, a beginning or the end in many ways, but it does at the same time, at least the way we understand it. Anyway, on the 17th of April, Virginia votes to secede, but it's not ratified until May 23rd. So just other things happening. More and more troops make their way into DC after Lincoln's call. The Baltimore riots happen on the 19th. A ship, the USS Pawnee, arrives on the Potomac to help defend the city. Lincoln says this quote on the 24th: "I don't believe there's any North." He feels cut off. He feels abandoned. And then the 7th New York State Militia, a 30-day unit. Talk about a brief time to serve, but a 30-day unit arrives in DC. And by the end of the month, there's about 11,000 soldiers in and around DC. So this is really the beginnings of the Civil War defenses of Washington. So when wars happen and when things like this happen, one thing also happens all the time: rumors. And rumors are just what we live with. So a few rumors: the Charleston floating battery, which was used against Fort Sumter, was heading north, perhaps coming up the Potomac to DC. People believe this. April 15th, the New York Times reports with satisfactory information that General Beauregard and an army of 20,000 rebels were immediately to march on Washington now that they had nothing else to do. Okay, and then the last one, secessionists in DC. Remember, like I said before, DC is kind of this border city. There's certainly people secession-minded, Confederate-minded in DC, just like other places in the South or wherever they are, plan to blow up the Capitol and the Treasury building and burn the White House and other public buildings. So if you think that sounds crazy, well, keep in mind the illustration I have next to it, where the British are burning public buildings in DC during the War of 1812. So this ain't so far-fetched, as we would say. These things could happen. Crazy times. A few items from Richmond newspaper. From the mountaintops and the valleys to the shores of the sea, there is one shout of fierce resolve to capture Washington City. And this flight of abolition harpies shall come down from the black north for their roost in the heart of the South to defile and brutalize the land. The fanatical yell for the immediate subjugation of the whole South is going up hourly from the united voices of all the North. And they have determined to hold Washington City at the point hence to carry on their brutal warfare. Our people can take it, and they will take it. That's what they're saying in Richmond. About a week later, Washington is the weak point of our enemies, and cannot Virginians and other Southerners reach Washington before this multitudinous and disorderly rabble arrives? I haven't used that word multitudinous like all year. So I'm really glad that I was able to get that off pretty well. I'm proud of myself. Okay. If companies and regiments and individuals from Richmond and Petersburg and from countries between the James River and the Blue Ridge and the Potomac and all over Virginia will hurry on to Alexandria and soon be joined by large forces of the Southern Confederacy. Soon, very soon, Davis and Beauregard and Lee of Virginia will be there to lead them on. This is kind of amazing to me because this is like 9 days after Lee writes his resignation. And they're already saying, hey, Lee of Virginia, help us out here. Let's take this place. That's actually pretty amazing when you think of it. One of the early men for the Union, soldiers of the Union, generals for the Union, was this man, Brigadier General Charles Pomeroy Stone. He made the Inspector General of DC Volunteers. This is something that he wrote, or written about him, that President Lincoln, April 15th, issued his call for 70,000 militia of several states of the Union and of DC for 3-month service. And the militia companies of the District of Columbia were the first to respond to the call. And approximately 2,000 officers and men were sworn into the United States service for a 3-month enlistment. That's at 75,000 for 90 days, 2,000 sworn in. And they were assigned the duty of guarding their approaches to the city and protection of the government property and buildings in and about Washington. So you have about 2,000 men from DC who answered this call. Pretty impressive. But again, like I said, there's some Confederate sympathies around, and we're still under a reign of terror. This is what somebody who's Confederate leaning feels. They're still under this reign of terror and oppression. But many of us have not refrained from fully or freely expressing our condemnation of the war policy of the administration and the folly and madness of the Black Republican Party. So there's not one war, there's not one for the maintenance and perpetuity of the Union, for this is a foregone conclusion, but one for the maintenance of the Chicago platform, i.e. the Republican Party and its calls for abolition and all this kind of stuff, at least they feel. The utter overthrow of the South and the extension of slavery. So this is things that people are really concerned about. And this is from our, down below, I've got it as our special Washington correspondence. So again, I don't know a number or anything like that, but this is how some people in DC are thinking. So another quote from Frederick County, Virginia, Joseph Long. He says, and as to the Capitol, it stands on Southern soil and it is as dear to Southerners, and I believe much more so than to Northern abolitionists. So again, you're getting this whole feeling that I'm talking about, that there is this sympathy in DC, but it doesn't actually succeed. There are some men who do fight for the Confederacy, though. And here's some examples of some of those. So one thing I've noticed that when it comes to, these are men who serve in Virginia regiments. There is no 1st DC Confederate, infantry or something like that. But there are companies, though. And when they enlist, they tend to enlist as a company, which is supposed to be about 100 men. Some companies were less. But anyway, Company E of the 1st Virginia Infantry. And this is a document that it's kind of like a smoking gun for me, because I know there's sometimes where people say, well, the Confederacy just wanted to be left alone and all that, but they did have their eyes on this place, DC. So this document on the left, this muster roll, it says this company was formed in Washington, DC in December 1860. War hadn't even started yet. Where's Fort Sumter? I've never heard of it. For the purpose of enforcing the surrender of the district to Maryland or Virginia when either seceded from the Union. Wow. And on the right there is a, from the service record of a George McDaniel of Company H of the Washington Volunteers. And I thought it was interesting because it says that he traveled 77 miles down below to reach Culpeper Courthouse. And if you check on a map, even today, of course, it's still, places haven't moved. Culpeper Courthouse, Virginia is still 77 miles from DC. A little information on the left there. This is, they have up at Gettysburg, if you've been there to visit the visitor center, great visitor center, of course. But they show there the number of enlistments for the Union and for the Confederacy for each state that participated in the Civil War. And it shows no Confederate enlistments. I guess that's technically true in the sense that they, like I said, they didn't raise a 1st DC Confederate infantry or something. But we know that there are certainly Confederates, and I've found about 300 or so that were from DC and served in the Confederacy. I've seen where some men were born in Alexandria, and of course, at the time where they were born, maybe in the late 1830s or early 1840s, Alexandria and this place too were still part of DC. So things like that. On the right there, this is from the Civil War Monitor Almanac, Civil War Monitor magazine, great magazine. But some of the information here is wrong, where it shows that, again, they have 16,534, so a few more than the one on the left, where it shows men for the Union, but none for the Confederacy. Again, that's wrong. And by the way, that 20,000 Confederate Marylanders just above that is also wrong, too. It's like more like 5,000. So part two, building the Civil War defenses of Washington. And it's all about the bridges, at least it is for me. I just throw this in here too, that about Black men who offered their services. So when Lincoln called for troops, some men said, hey, I'll serve too. But at the time, they were not opening up enlistments to African Americans. This man, Jacob Dodson, and that is not a picture of him. There's no known picture of him. I just used an unidentified picture, but he's born free in Maryland, and his family worked for a congressman. He participated in expeditions to the Western Territories, but he wrote Secretary of War Simon Cameron in April 1861, when you call for 75,000 troops, I can raise 300 Black men for the Union Army, and Cameron refused his offer. We're not enlisting Blacks at this time. That comes later. It does happen, but not now. And that the first United States colored infantry is from DC, but again, that comes later, 2 years later. So as I mentioned before, May 23rd is when Virginia formally secedes. They vote to secede like April 17th or whatever. Not until May 23rd do they actually secede. Once that happens, this happens. This is crossing the Long Bridge under the moonlight on the late night and early morning of May 23rd, 24th to occupy Virginia. This is from Harper's Weekly and on June 8th, but it shows that's that long column. Pretty powerful image, I believe, showing them crossing this bridge. I just put this up here because it reminded me so much of this photo. If you've seen the D-Day photo before, anyone? And I know that that D-Day photo is just kind of, it's not certainly a lot of very graphic, but it still kind of emits that power, these men getting off the landing craft to go fight the war on the continent. And to me, they really just kind of go with each other. It just kind of still has that same kind of power. Maybe you might see it differently, but I just really like that imagery. So this shows the army it was that occupied Arlington. And this army was called the Army of Northeastern Virginia, part of this Department of Northeastern Virginia. Winfield Scott commanded it, and it's pretty cool. I've never seen a battle map on this, but I've read about this, where the right column, which took the Aqueduct Bridge just below Georgetown, it's made up of those regiments listed there. The center column took the Long Bridge, and that's the one where you saw before going across the Long Bridge, those different regiments to occupy the heights there. And then and the occupation of Alexandria further downriver was done by the 11th New York Zouaves and the 5th Massachusetts. And if you're familiar with that incident that happens at the Marshall House Hotel, where the young officer, Elmer Ellsworth, takes down this flag, huge flag. He didn't do it by himself, I know that. But anyway, the flag comes down, Confederate flag flying from this hotel. He's shot and killed. That's where that comes from. That's May 24th, 1861, the date listed there. So this is an item from the Washington Evening Star. Anybody remember the Star? Long time ago. Anyway, at 4 o'clock this morning, a large number of government wagons went across the Long Bridge loaded with picks and shovels and all manner of tools. So not just carrying guns. You don't see them in that picture. But they were accompanied by a full corps of carpenters and workmen. But let's get going, okay? And they're busy throwing up fortifications on the heights of the Virginia shore, commencing at daybreak. And then the quote below showing troops quartered at Georgetown, and then they're crossing that bridge and they're also going to occupy the heights in that direction as well. And that's an image there of the Long Bridge guarded by the Veteran Reserve Corps, a later war thing, 60,000 men there, and the veteran VRC guarding the Long Bridge. And being from DC, I really like this. We remind the public that the fact that the 1st Regiment, 1st Company, and the first soldier ever raised to defend the Union against the rebels was in the city of Washington. I know a lot of people know about the Civil War. I'm not sure people know that so much. Let it be known, too, that the first Union company to cross the Long Bridge was the National Rifles. So not just even the first raised, but I think that that was also something maybe strategic, that these are men from DC, if they're used to crossing that bridge, if they know the area of Arlington, perhaps they were also selected to go across first. So talking about first forts built, it's kind of hard to say. I guess really there's a number built at the same time, and they're building them, like I said, at the foots of these bridges. But one of the first definitely is Fort Runyon. It was built in 7 weeks, and it was 1,484 perimeter yards. Now, if you think about that, think about how big a football field is. What is that? That's like 120 yards. So it's a lot of football fields. And it guards the southern end of the Long Bridge. And it was named for Brigadier General Theodore Runyon, who commanded the 4th Division of this Army of Northeastern Virginia. Now, of course, if you think of a name like that, you think of the Confederates. This is before they were using that name. To be honest, the Confederate Army at First Bull Run was known as the Army of the Potomac. So it's kind of crazy that they had different names, each other's names sort of, but that again comes later. That is the Long Bridge today, if you will. Of course, it's taking the VRE across over into Virginia. And you can see the Washington Monument and Jefferson Memorial in the background. And this is just kind of an overlay of the 2 maps, the Civil War map below, but you can see above it, there's from Google Maps or wherever, just the kind of these locations. And you'll see right there, Fort Runyon, that 395 goes right through it. There's certainly a lot of changes here, but basically Fort Runyon, the whole site's gone. There's some signage, but 395, the next time you go, I guess that way, you're just going right through Fort Runyon. More on the bridges of DC. So another bridge is the Aqueduct Bridge. This one, that's looking north towards Georgetown there. You see the 2 men in the foreground. Pay close attention to the man on the right, by the way. But anyway, that shows Georgetown in the back, and that's the Aqueduct Bridge, which, you know, the Key Bridge replaced it. But one thing that is actually still there is that pier of the bridge. And if you look, I think this is really cool. If you look in the picture, you can see it right there. So there's still something left. It's not completely gone, but I think that's pretty neat that we still have that. So like I said, if you note the guy with the top hat and with the boots and everything, you'll also see him here at Fort Corcoran. And he's on the right in this picture, and he's on the right in both pictures. Look at the extreme right. I don't know if he was one of the photographers or something, or if he was just a guy who was just really into photography and just liked to get his picture taken as much as he could. I have no idea. It's interesting that he's wearing the same clothing, so maybe these pictures were all taken on the same day. But anyway, this is the wagon entrance to the Fort Corcoran, and these are officers of the 4th New York Heavy Artillery at Fort Corcoran in 1862. So I'm guessing these are all pictures from 1862. Here's another picture of soldiers on Mason's Island, which is now Theodore Roosevelt Island, looking north towards Georgetown, DC. See how I have it written? Because at the time it was a separate town in the District of Columbia. Don't forget, Georgetown predates DC by like 50 years or whatever. It was from the 1750s. And at one time it was actually part of Prince George's County, believe it or not. But of course, Montgomery County came along within DC. But anyway, you can see the bridge there. and that's Georgetown College there. But yeah, the Aqueduct Bridge in the distance. So Fort Corcoran, this is that fort after 3 weeks. There's a topographical map in this New York Irish American Weekly, a name for Colonel Michael Corcoran of the 69th New York. And this shows the gallant 69th New York State Militia digging trenches and erecting breastworks. Here, this is in with Georgetown in the distance. Frank Leslie's illustrated in June 1861. And here's another image of Fort Corcoran, office of the 69th New York, next to one of the big guns. And this says, the solid walls of Fort Corcoran, and best of all, the firm columns of our zealous volunteers, show the defense we have upon our borders. This is all before First World Run that you see these images and see all this going on. So much for an undefended city. The next is the Chain Bridge, which I took, by the way, to get here today. That Chain Bridge name, there's been a number of bridges in that location called the Chain Bridge. And this is, I'll show you what it looked like during the war. But this is, excuse me, this is the heights above the Chain Bridge, which you can kind of see down there way in the distance. And, excuse me. But you can see they have a battery of guns up there. A battery is 2 or more guns. So a battery of guns on the heights above the Chain Bridge. So they can get a good look at the approach, see what's coming. There's also a lower battery on the Chain Bridge itself. So this is the looking towards the DC side. So on the end there, on this part, there's guns right at the end of the bridge. But both of these locations are from the same point, because you'll see that little guardhouse there with the stain even on the side, and you see them in both pictures. And this is the Virginia side of the Chain Bridge. There's something of a famous story, just give you real quick, about a sleeping sentinel, man who was supposed to be guarding the Chain Bridge, Union soldier from Vermont, fell asleep. It's like the most famous thing he did during the war. He fell asleep, and he was supposed to be shot for this. But Lincoln spares his life, and then later he's fighting on the peninsula. He gets killed, and they go to bury him. And when they go to bury him, they find the bones of a Revolutionary War soldier. So great story. There was a movie made about it, an old silent movie from a long time ago called The Sleeping Sentinel, of course. So this is that lower battery of the Chain Bridge guarding the DC side. You might notice that there's similar guns. So it's, you know, I guess whatever defenses they can get, but they have this bridge heavily enough defended. And this picture apparently was so popular that it was included in this 1961 Civil War Centennial photograph, calendar, excuse me. But it's the same picture you'll see there. Okay, defenses of the Chain Bridge in DC. And that, of course, is the bridge today. So it might not seem like much in terms of this approach getting across the river, but it's important to have that bridge defended. And it was never really something that the Confederates, in my knowledge, really approached. So this shows Fort Ellsworth, another early fort. This talks about right here, June 26th, again before First World Run. Test this afternoon of the rifle cannon at Fort Ellsworth. These field works have been, of course, an erection on several weeks on Shooter's Hill and approaching completion, resulting in giving the utmost satisfaction. 32 pounders were fired, and all the guns have been mounted and everything. So this fort is complete and ready to go. So it's also been asked the question on how many forts were there in the Civil War defenses of Washington. There were 68 forts, but were they all built at the same time? No, they were not all built at the same time. And I was very curious as to like how this process happened, you know, how many forts did they have at this time or whatever. There's no like running thing going on that I know of, but by July 29th, this is Henry Hunt, who's the Brevet Major in Chief of Artillery for this Army of Northeastern Virginia at the time, reporting that there are 29 forts I'm sorry, there are 4 forts and 8 batteries in the Civil War defenses, and that's Fort Albany, Fort Runyon, Fort Ellsworth, and Corcoran, and describing the abilities and how many guns those different forts have. So this is showing the map here of pretty much what I've talked about. There's Fort Corcoran, and some that I put in later, like Fort C.F. Smith and stuff. Those are built later on, but the ones in white, Fort Bennett, Fort Haggerty, these are all built in 1861, in the spring and summer of 1861. And the gentleman there at the right, bottom right, Fort Daniel Woodbury, he is his fort was named Fort Woodbury. It's down there at the bottom, kind of in the center of the bottom, and it was named Fort Woodbury. But there was occasions where forts had one name, but they were changed later on, like Fort Pennsylvania, for instance, in D.C. was later changed to Fort Reno when Jesse Reno was killed at South Mountain. Daniel Woodbury was also killed, but there was no need to rename the fort because it was already named Fort Woodbury. And here's more of the Arlington lines. That's this defensive line, very important. What was it? I think, again, the heart and soul, really, of the Civil War defenses of Washington, going kind of counterclockwise, Fort Tillinghast, Fort Craig, Fort Richardson, Fort Albany, and there's Fort Runyon and Fort Jackson, which is right at the foot of the Long Bridge. And you see up at the top of the Arlington House. No forts were built there on the Arlington House, but of course, Arlington Cemetery comes later. But it was also very important to occupy those heights. I can't stress that enough. Just the high ground. The Civil War is all about the high ground. Get the high ground, you can really command the field. I mentioned earlier this ship, the USS Pawnee. Like I said, it arrived. So it's kind of this floating gun platform, of course, during the Civil War, arrives on the Potomac. And her importance did not go unnoticed by Confederate authorities. So even they're aware of this. Very important to have this ship as these fortifications are being built. And I didn't think about saying this earlier. Remember, all these forts were earthen forts. There's no brick and mortar, anything like that. They're all earthen forts, which actually turns out to be better, more efficient. The brick gets knocked down easier. So building them out of earthworks was good. And of course, some of that is preserved today. A little bit, but not much. Part 3, ending here. Could the Confederate Army have made a serious attack on D.C. after First Bull Run? That's this Confederate Army of the Potomac, like I mentioned. So this quote here from our special Washington correspondent, once again. Of course, we all shed tears, but some were more tears of joy than sorrow. Not that we rejoice at the death of any man or victory over the Constitution and the Union, but because it was a glorious victory over the vile presumptiveness of a wicked and unholy sectional organization for the overthrow and utter annihilation of people and institutions. Talking about slavery. Of 15 sovereign states, they are thoroughly fortifying themselves behind their works on Arlington Heights, where they will rest for the present. There they will coax an attack, though I am not of the opinion of General Beauregard intends this to be a war of conquest, simply one of defense. So there's some difference of opinion on what to do next after this glorious victory at First Bull Run. The image there showing this is the death of General Francis Bartow, who commanded the Georgia Brigade. And this is before they had the St. Andrew's Cross battle flag. It's the early First National flag. But you could see him right there, kind of where I'm circling, where he's raising his fist. He's been shot, he's dying, and his troops are moving forward. So First Bull Run's a long battle, and this is what different Confederates had to say. So I don't believe until that place is taken, D.C., or level in ashes can we hope for peace. That's from a Simeon Gibbons, who commands the 10th Virginia, and James Longstreet, who later becomes, of course, Lee's right-hand man and everything, after Jackson's death, of course. But he says that Alexandria would probably have fallen into our hands without a struggle. We might have forced the enemy to evacuate its works south of the Potomac, but very likely not until after a fight in which our loss would have been greater than the object to be accomplished. So he's saying it's not really a good idea. And I guess Longstreet's kind of careful like that because he has that same kind of caution later on in the war at Pickett's charge. We might have transferred our line to the banks of the Potomac, but we could not have held it or would eventually have been compelled to abandon it. So he doesn't really see much wisdom in trying to make this kind of attack across the river into DC. Another account, this Lieutenant Thomas Pitts of the 3rd South Carolina. He wrote his wife and he said that he thinks that the move would be against Arlington Heights and Alexandria, those places I showed on the map. And so it says, if so, I tremble for the result, for I assure you that many, very many of us have seen our homes and our friends for the last time. So if you remember this, when I showed you before, the clip of this general, this is a movie, of course, where he's saying that we're going to go up there, we're going to break that line, and when the Yankees run away, it's going to be an open road all the way to Washington. Of course, this is a couple of years later, but still, even in 1861, what actual Confederates said, I tremble for the result, for I assure you that very many of us have seen our homes, friends for the last time. It's very different than what you're seeing in this film. So this is my last slide. This shows the Civil War defenses of Washington on September 30th. And this is a list of the different works. And this is showing the ones on the left are forts in Virginia. And there's more in Virginia, but some of the ones that get into DC are Battery Vermont, well, Battery Martin Scott, Battery Cameron, Fort Gaines, Fort Pennsylvania, later Fort Reno, Fort Massachusetts, later Fort Stevens, Fort Slocum, and the rest, those are all in DC. So by this time, September 30th, there's 19 of these 32 forts are in Virginia. There's 29 forts and 3 batteries. And as I mentioned, some names were changed. So that's all I have. So thank you very much. And I will go ahead, I know there's questions. I will go ahead and take any questions you have. So, yes, sir.
For that date of September, how many of those forts in Virginia were defeated or defensible by the time the first Bull Run battle was fought? Did I was 2.5 months before that?
Yeah, I believe that these are forts that are showing that they are completed by this time. If you're talking about this list, what's that? Okay, I'm sorry. The question was, how many of these forts are completed by this late September 1861? Did I understand you correctly?
How many would have been defeated in July if the Confederate Army would have just kept on coming towards DC after Bull Run?
Okay, so how many were completed by July? Yeah. Well, if you remember before, I showed the slide where, yeah, right here. So this is by the end of July. And yeah, so if you take a look at that and it's showing the contents of these different forts, that's basically this is a week after First Bull Run, but this gives you an idea on what, and these guard roads and everything like that. So the question again, how many of these forts were completed by the end of July if the Confederates, and there was some movement, but not an effective movement enough towards DC. Yes.
Sir, who gave the early orders to actually occupy the Arlington portion of Virginia? It seems like they moved quickly, they moved rather intelligently to build that perimeter defense around Washington. Who's behind it?
Well, that's Winfield Scott. Remember, like I said, he's in command of this army of Northeastern Virginia. So Winfield Scott is the one who says, and he's a Virginian too, don't forget. So the question is, who gave the early orders to occupy the heights? That comes from Winfield Scott. And I think it's very, very important. Again, just impressed with the terrain there. I mean, you can, even in this room where it's like the stadium seating, if you're up there, you can command the whole thing. You can see the whole area. So it's very, very important to occupy those heights. And another question?
Yes, sir. Is commerce continuing across the lines? Are people selling cattle and crops and things back and forth still?
So the question is commerce continuing across the lines? I don't really have the answer to that so much, except to say that these bridges are guarded. So for those people going back and forth, How much they did to begin with, I don't really know. But you know, it's important to guard those bridges and to, I guess, check. I know I've seen images, I think, where wagons were checked. What are you taking across the bridge and things like that. So if it's continuing, it's certainly continuing under military authority. Yeah.
Confederate espionage needed to be particularly good, seeing as all this stuff was in the press. But how would they have known what they would have faced if they had come towards DC?
How would they have known? How would Confederates have known what they were facing had they come towards DC? I guess for me, the best way to answer that is the fact that they never really did. So, you know, if these guns provide enough intimidation on these heights, anytime I've seen at least depictions or read about depictions of trying to take, you know, different heights, the Battle of Malvern Hill, Lee fights uphill actually, and he tries to take that position in July 1862, and that fails. You know, Fredericksburg in December 1862, the Union tries to take those positions. Marie's Heights, that fails. So it's definitely not an easy thing to fight uphill like that and to try to take this fortified position. How well they would have known, I think certainly, you know, as we see from a Washington correspondent, and newspapers back then certainly could be dubious and not the best information, yeah. But I think that they apparently knew enough. You know, they do try to attack the forts later on in 1864, the most serious attack, the Battle of Fort Stevens. But I often think personally, I'll say this, when you talk about these people, like, you know, they claim 20,000 Marylanders, for example, which I know isn't true, like I said. If something like that was actually raised, if that 20,000 men is an army. So if there really were 20,000 men, their biggest mistake, in my opinion, was crossing the Potomac at all. They could have stayed and harassed the area. I know that there's Confederates from Northern Virginia, from places like Arlington, Fairfax, Alexandria, or wherever, but they, you know, go ahead and move with the army and fight, you know, with Lee or whoever in the Army of Northern Virginia in those places where they fight. But, you know, basically the area is occupied, and those Confederates, they take off. I hope that answers your question. Yes, ma'am.
Looking at this letter, it looks to me like in the event of an emergency, these batteries could hold for a while, but they're in pretty bad shape in many instances. But it also mentions that there are German regiments involved in this. And you didn't mention this, but I'm curious as to what kind of German regiments were these, and what were they doing here in the United States at the time that this was being set up? What is the history of those units?
Okay. Yeah. So the German regiments. Her question is, you know, thank you for pointing out that these batteries aren't perfect, but also there's German regiments involved. Those are regiments of men who either individuals who came to the United States before the Civil War, or maybe they came, you know, for the war or whatever, on their own. I think there was some recruiting overseas, but typically it's the immigration that took place before the war in the 1840s and 50s. And these Germans, they enlist in different regiments. I know, like the 8th New York, I think, was a German regiment and such. And they help build these forts because they're part of the army. This is before any kind of draft, first of all. Everybody who enlists in 1861 is a volunteer. Every single person, whether you're talking about the Union or the Confederacy. So these are men who come on their own accord. I think perhaps enlisting in the army, I guess maybe they felt it was a fast track to becoming a citizen or something, but they also answer the call. Yes, ma'am.
About built up by the U.S. government or for weapons, food, clothing, etc., or was that a part of the volunteer effort that these volunteers brought that with them?
So the question is, I guess, basically the buildup for the war effort. if I'm understanding you correctly, how did all that happen and such. As I said before, the Civil War was neither a declared or undeclared war. It also really wasn't a very well prepared for war. And I think it's part of the reason why it lasts as long as it does. It's part of the reason why the death toll is as much as it is. Right now, they're saying it's about 750,000 dead from the Civil War of all causes, most of that being disease. But like in World War II, for example, you have a peacetime draft in 1940. I forget how many people are involved, but the Army does prepare some. And even with that effort, it still kind of lacked a lot of things. I'll get to you in a minute, sir. There's enough industry in the North that they can mobilize, but it does take time. So again, neither side really prepared very well. I think it's interesting, for one thing, and there's something I guess you have to be very careful with the war. But one thing that really stuck out to me on this was that, like I said, Virginia voted to secede, but didn't formally secede until like a month later. And that's when, from that point, that's when the Army crosses into Virginia. They don't start building before that. Think about it, for example, had they built these forts, after Fort Sumter started building in Arlington. Why? Because Virginia may stay loyal. Maybe they'll change their mind, I don't know. But it's as soon as they do go Confederate, that they're like, bam, we're gonna get across, we're gonna occupy that area. Interesting that the Confederates didn't do this themselves, but that's what happens. Yes, sir.
Papers of the time, and to this very day, said it was an easy road to Washington, no problem. However, Joe Johnson, one officer, was a high-ranking officer for the War Department right before the war. He would have known all the topography of this area. Couldn't it be that he decided it should be such a royal pain to get through the heights of Arlington? Roads were narrow, were easily blocked. He decided we're not going to do it.
So the question is, Joe Johnston, U.S. Army officer, he's Confederate. He's at the first Bull Run. Some of his troops are there on the field at first Bull Run. And he basically said, let's not do this. It's not going to work. If I understand you correctly? Yeah. Between Johnston and Beauregard, and they're in kind of command of two different armies there was a difference of opinion. I think Beauregard was the one who wanted to go, but Johnston, kind of like you're saying, was very cautious about this. Let's not do this. And remember, their troops are kind of worn out after the first battle as well. So I think if this answers your question, I think that the Yankees were kind of always one step ahead of the Confederates on this. Given this state, as you kind of pointed out, these forts are still kind of in their infancy. If the Army of Northern Virginia that comes later, if an army of that strength and experience and stuff had existed, I'm talking about Lee's army in the late summer of 1862, the Maryland campaign, if they had been there at this time, that could have been very different. So that's what I'm saying is that I think, again, it's kind of, it's a growth for both sides, really. But I think that they just always kind of stayed one step ahead of the Confederacy. And I think it paid off for them, of course. But that's my thought on it. So if that answers your question. Okay.
Hey, Brian, why don't you ask Marty if there's any questions online?
Okay. Do we have any, thank you. Do we have any questions online at all?
Yeah, I got a couple questions. One from Mary says, what do you know about Fort Ethan Allen near Chain Bridge in North Arlington?
I know that a portion of it still exists. I think some of the earthworks are still there. There's some cannon that have been placed there. And at least for today, it's got a great it's got a plaque of what the fort looked like and some great placards with some great history. So personally, I think it's a really great site to do some interpretive history on the forts and everything. It also is where I think the first use of a military balloon flew from Fort Ethan Allen. Okay,
Okay, and then one last question, which is, what is your day-to-day scope and responsibility as part of the Park Service with these forts?
okay. So what is my day-to-day responsibility? It's kind of really cool talking to like a disembodied voice like this. It's like, is this God? So, no, my day-to-day, is, well, I'm trying to do things, to really get out this story. I'm always about interpretation. Over the last year or so, first couple of years on the job, I did a series called Friday's Fort where I talked about each fort. And by the way, let me let you all know that those sites are all there. Like I said, there may be no fort there or whatever. There's 17 fort sites today, that are managed by the National Park Service, where some of these 68 forts were. There's a few others that are not under the National Park Service. Fort Ethan Allen, for example, is not under the Park Service. Fort Ward, which is, there's a good portion of the fort left. There's a great gate. There's a great visitor center. If you haven't seen Fort Ward, either here or out there or online or whatever, go check it out sometime. It's in Alexandria. That is not under the Park Service. It's under the city of Alexandria. So some sites are not NPS, but when I did my Friday's Fort series on Facebook, I just wrote about each fort and included some illustrations and stuff. And now I'm actually doing a series called Saturday Soldier about soldiers who were killed or wounded in the Battle of Fort Stevens in July of 1864, and maybe some others involved in the Civil War defenses of Washington. What else do I do?
Walking tour.
Walking tours. Thank you. Thank you. It's really bad when you forget what you do. So I also give my office site is Battleground National Cemetery, where there's the soldiers who were killed in the Battle of Fort Stevens. There's some monuments there. I give interpretive tours there, some different walking tours. I'm giving a walking tour this Saturday in DC from Fort Stevens to Battleground Cemetery at 11 a.m. So that's another thing I do. And we also manage the summer concert series out of Fort DuPont in the summer, of course. Fort DuPont's in Southeast DC. It's the site of the fort. Today it's a concert pavilion. Yeah, and I answer emails too. So
And one other last one. Owen asks, and it's actually not a forts thing, but you may have some expertise in this. The military road in Arlington, was this constructed after the Union Army pushed into Virginia?
I'm not sure, but I don't know if that was the military
It's kind of unfair
road.
to ask you a question that's not related to forts, but it's a good question.
No, to me, I think all of that, the forts, the batteries, the rifle pits, and the military roads. There's only 2 military roads left. The one in Arlington, which is, I think, right by Fort Ethan Allen. So I don't know if that was the same road or whatever. And now it's just a regular road in Arlington today. And there's also a military road in DC, right by Fort DeRussy, which is across from St. John's High School. These are, I guess, representative at least of any military roads, but it definitely is something that was used in the Civil War defenses of Washington, because one thing the Civil War was also about was these interior lines to be able to get men and material from one place to another. So certainly military roads and kind of an interior lines, if you will, was used in the Civil War defenses of Washington.
Well, good. Thank you from the Zoom world. That's all we have.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir. In the back.
What kind of construction of forts? Did they use local labor? Did they hire some slave help to get those rather expensive forts built?
Good question. Who built these forts for real? Who actually did the labor? There was labor from, I guess, enslaved people. I haven't really looked into that completely, but these would have at least been people who were evolving towards freedom, if you will. Slavery still exists in DC, so they could have hired somebody out. And this is really before an emancipation policy comes up. So is very important for people who are like DC enslavers to, if they were still pro-union, then they might hire their enslaved people out to the government to help build the forts. Other than that, one thing I also do think is important, which I've learned a little more about, is where the land came from in the first place. And that was in cases of local people who own these farms or whatever, where all of these forts are in Arlington or in DC. It's all a rural area at the time. It's all farmland. And really the Civil War defenses of Washington is like the most famous thing to happen in the area at the time. Really builds up Arlington, builds up DC. I know that there are some, I think Fort Reno is an example of one that was built in DC with enslaved labor or built by Black people. Some of the others I'm not really completely sure about. Certainly you see in the illustration, you see the soldiers building them themselves. One thing, if you look at, while we're on the subject, if you look at some of the early pictures of the war, and they show soldiers in camp. I mentioned the 8th New York, and I mention them again because they were one of the German regiments. One thing I think is really interesting to me, and I don't know the answer to this either, but a lot of times you'll see these pictures. 8th New York is one, 2nd Rhode Island is another. I don't have them to pull up for you, but there's one common denominator in a lot of these early pictures in camp, like in 1861 and stuff, is that often there's a young Black child in the picture. What I'm not sure of, it's always a young Black boy. I don't know what that's about, but it always is. And I think it's really interesting. Don't know who these people were, but again, we know soldiers did some of it. There was some enslaved labor. I don't know a lot about it, but yeah. Any other questions out in Zoom land?
No, we're good.
What's that?
We're good. You satisfied the Zoom world.
Okay. All right. Yes, sir, right here.
How do these sports keep in touch with each other?
How do the forts keep in touch with each other? If they have couriers, if they have, and many of these forts are not too far apart. You can see on that's as far as the back is going to let me go.
Well, Bryan,
Yeah, right here.
Bryan sorting through, Arlington was the first use of rubberized telegraph cable. They bypassed the use of having to put the holes because it took so long. So telegraph was widely used. They did, but they did connect the ports with telegraph.
Right. Thanks, Peter. So you can get an idea, and I'm not really all familiar with where some of these places are, but if that'll give you some idea that if they have signals, telegraph, couriers, or whatever, that they can move between these different forts. And there again is the southern end of that. For some, and if you look too, you'll look on where Fort Tillinghast and Craig and Fort Richardson are, you'll see the rifle pits there. And some of these are also military roads that you'll see like behind these different forts. So that it gives you some idea. I'm not sure of the distance really, but that I guess is really how a lot of your communication will take place. There's another story real quick. I forget when this happened, but one man was, I think, in one of the encampments around these forts or whatever, and he decides to desert. So he just walks away. The only thing is that he didn't think about the forward pickets. So where he walked to, he thought he was like home free, and he walks some distance, like I said, maybe a mile or two or whatever it is. And he tells somebody whatever, and then they find him and they realize it's actually a soldier that this man encounters, this deserter encounters. And he is brought back, he's arrested, he is actually shot for desertion. But I think it was from somewhere here in this Arlington line. I forget the soldier's name, But this also something did happen. Any other questions? Well, thank you all very much. I really do appreciate it.